12th. This is a work session on our legislative agenda. Thank you all for being here today. And somewhere I have some great talking points. Here they are. This is obviously our annual work session on the city's 2020 federal and state legislative agenda. And as you know, the actions of both the federal and the state government are critically important as we tackle the many challenges that face the city of Portland. I look forward to the discussion this morning on how we prioritize our advocacy, and we're going to start by turning things over to Elizabeth Edwards, who's our very able Director of Government Relations. Good morning, Elizabeth.
We'll see if I can get this microphone at the right placement.
That sounds about right there.
Good morning, Mayor and members of Council. Elizabeth Edwards, Director of the Office of Government Relations, for the record. As the Mayor stated, we're here.
Elizabeth, move the mic down closer to your face.
Closer to my face, okay.
It moves.
This one doesn't, it doesn't articulate right there. Oh, right here?
Yeah. that
Okay.
one.
How about now?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the help. So we're going to discuss the draft federal and state legislative agendas for 2020 today, and a little bit about the format. We're going to start with the federal side, take a break.
I can't see those microphones. Can you use this one?
Sure.
Oh,
Always.
It'll be 15 minutes while we
Yeah.
figure out the microphone.
Send them to recycling.
It's tough when you're 5'3" to really hit it just right. So
Why is
hopefully
it coming from?
you can hear me all right.
You keep talking.
Okay. All right, sounds good. So we're going to start with the federal, and then we'll move to the state. We'll switch who's up at the witness desk for that portion. We're going to use a PowerPoint presentation. You all should have a hard copy, and folks at home can follow along on the screen. And we'll start with an overview of the lay of the land in Washington, D.C., and then in Salem. And then we'll go through some of the top-line issues in both locations before then going into discussing the contents of the draft agendas. So as always, this is a conversation. Please feel free to ask questions as we go. With me today, I'd love to introduce Vicki Cram, the City of Portland's representative in Washington, D.C., and Neil Stillstrom, our Federal Government Relations Manager. I'm also pleased to introduce Haley Tortorella. Haley's been with our office about 2 months now, and she is an associate supporting both the state and federal programs. So she'll be with me for the entire block this morning. So with that, we'll switch to the next slide. Congress meets in 2-year cycles. We're coming to the close of the first session of the 116th Congress, and 2020 will be the second session of the 116th Congress. So as such, we've taken the priorities and policy positions from the 2019 federal legislative and regulatory agenda and used those as the foundation for the 2020 draft agenda that's before you. And basically using this as an opportunity to amend or reaffirm the items that are in that agenda. And we'll walk through the changes and updates that are being proposed in the draft for 2020. A little bit about how we got here. Process for developing this draft started in early September by sending out issue sheets to the bureaus and council offices soliciting their input on what changes should be made. In mid-October, we met with all of the council offices and many of the bureaus, and then we followed that up with meetings with our congressional delegation offices. We shared the ideas that we had heard, we got their feedback, and we learned about their priorities for 2020 to make sure that there are large areas of overlap. Now, before going any further and really starting with the lay of the land, I wanted to just pause for a second and address the elephant in the room. I think we all know that tomorrow begins the impeachment, the public hearings for the impeachment inquiry against the president. Obviously, this creates a lot of chaos and many more unknowns, but for the purposes of this presentation and our conversation today, we're not going to focus on those proceedings more than necessary. So just kind of put that, dog-ear that page. So on the next slide, this is a snapshot of Congress. We continue to have a divided Congress. Republicans still control the Senate. Democrats control the House. I just briefly note that this differs from what's going on in state legislatures across the country. Almost every state legislature has single-party control. Minnesota is the exception, where you have split-party control. Nebraska is a unicameral body, so they're always single-party control. And Virginia, which has off-cycle elections, just flipped both chambers. So they went from Republican control of both chambers to Democratic control of both chambers. So it's actually an interesting juxtaposition between the federal government and what we're seeing in state houses across the country.
Elizabeth, is this unprecedented, or has this happened previously in U.S. history? Do we know?
It is unique. I have not done a review about if we've ever been quite at this place before, but the fact that we are so partisan is sort of exemplified by this sort of solidarity of control across different states.
Okay, thank you.
So in the Senate, we have 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents who caucus with Democrats. And on the House, we have 233 Democrats, 197 Republicans, 1 independent who doesn't caucus with either party, and 4 vacancies. And looking at the executive branch, the Trump administration is in its 3rd year, with several key departments continuing to be overseen by acting secretaries. And because of the strained and increasingly strained relationship with Congress, this administration is relying more and more on its executive power in order to enact policies. We'll turn to the next slide. This is a snapshot of our Oregon delegation. I just note that we have really strong partners representing us at the federal level. We maintain good working relationships with the members and their staffs, both in Washington, D.C. and here in Oregon. And our delegation is really well placed in their respective chambers, with Senator Wyden as the ranking member on the Finance Committee, which is the committee that oversees tax policy in the Senate. Senator Merkley serving on the Appropriations Committee, where he's done a lot of good work on housing and other issues that the city cares about. And we have a lot of leadership on the House side, with Congressman DeFazio as the chair of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Congressman Blumenauer on the Ways and Means Committee and the chair of the Trade Subcommittee there, Congressman Walden as the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, where Congressman Schrader also serves, and Congresswoman Bonamici is a member of the House Select Committee on Climate Crisis. Two more things to note before moving on from this slide. One is that Congressman Walden has announced his retirement, so he won't seek re-election after 2020. And I think we probably all know that under current projections, Oregon is poised to receive a 6th congressional seat, likely to receive a 6th congressional seat through the results of the 2020 census. So we'll continue to watch that very, very closely. Now, before moving forward, I just want to do a quick look back. We're in especially confounding and frustrating times. And so it's important to show that some good work can still happen at the federal level. So this is a quick snapshot of some of the things that were accomplished for the city in 2019. We received $3.25 million in the Urban Area Security Initiative funding. That's administered by the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management, and at the regional level by the Regional Disaster Preparedness Office for disaster planning and asset development. This past month, the Portland Water Bureau...
Excuse me, Elizabeth.
Yes.
Excuse me. I think that that grant, even though we've received it every year, I think our rating continues to drop. So we were like 30th last time, and they only funded 30. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? And so how are you thinking about next year?
In our meetings with council offices and bureaus in mid-October, this was a topic that came up time and again, actually amongst many bureaus, not just the Bureau of Emergency Management. And we talked in a very collaborative manner with a variety of bureaus about what are all of the threats. I mean, the thing about the Urban Area Security Initiative is really you're identifying both man-made and natural disasters that may impact our area and how we rank against other large urban areas. And so identifying how we may be unique, what some of those unique threats are, and really making the case. And there's a portion of that criteria that is sort of a black box, we just don't know, but it's about really putting forward what are things that have changed in the past, what are things that are positioning us differently. And so it's everything from looking at potential wildland fires in Forest Park to what it means to have large-scale disturbances on our streets in downtown.
Or large oil trains exploding in our community?
Absolutely.
So is that something that we've actually talked about in previous grants, do you know?
Yeah.
I don't know which one to use.
Here you go.
Certainly, we haven't talked about the oil trains, but we have talked about the oil farm and a lot of other elements like that. We do get an opportunity, I think we're going to start in January, start laying out to the Department of Homeland Security our specific individual circumstances. Maybe have the mayor meet with the Department of Homeland Security when he comes back in January to Washington, D.C. And then after having done that, they will send us our ranking. The Department of Homeland Security will send us a ranking, and we have an opportunity then to rebut that ranking. And so we will make sure that hopefully we will have already made the case, but we will have another opportunity to be able to make it at that time too.
I just saw some fabulous pictures, and as they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words about how corroded those tanks are. Mm-hmm. And so whatever we can provide you to make sure that people understand that this is like not a pie in the sky, but a real threat in our community would be helpful.
Great, thank you.
Continuing on down the list, this past month, the Portland Water Bureau was invited to apply for a Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act loan of $554 million to build out the Bull Run treatment program, including a filtration plant. I'd note that actually Senator Merkley created the WIFIA program back in 2015. So it's a great area of Oregon alignment.
So thank you to our team for helping to do that, and particularly to Senator Merkley, who I know was a big advocate. I do want to make clear that we don't actually have it yet, that we've been invited to apply, which isn't a guarantee that we're going to get it. So the slide looks like it's a done deal, but in fact, we won't know until next year.
Thank you for that clarification. We can make sure that we can update that slide to make sure it reflects the language in a clearer way. This year, the city finally also received a total of $770,000 from Burn Jag funding from 2 different awards. These have been held up by the administration due to sanctuary jurisdiction issues, and were finally released based on a litigation strategy. We've also been working closely with our congressional delegation on making sure that the city's position on Portland Harbor is clear. I think especially when you have so many different parties involved, it's been important to have very clear communications with our delegation and a strong working relationship. We've advocated for addressing the climate crisis and work closely with allies in both the House and the Senate. It's worth noting that this is an issue that we're pushing at every level of government. We also sent delegations to Washington, D.C., including the mayor, Commissioner Udaley, the representatives from the Bureau of Transportation, the Water Bureau, and Environmental Services. And we've worked closely with national and local partners to help leverage their expertise and bolster coalitions around, national coalitions around issues that cities care about. Last but not least, we've provided comment, largely in opposition to a number of actions by the administration. And this is both an opportunity to state our values, as well as, in many instances, provide legal standing should there be a litigation strategy down the line. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Vicki for the political landscape from Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. For the record, and good morning, Mayor and Commissioners.
Good to see
For
you.
the record, my name is Vicki Cram, and I'm a principal at Squire Patton Boggs. Our slide here shows some key budget dates for FY 2020, and which is the current fiscal year, and FY 2021. There is one date that isn't there because it's passed, and that was September 30th, which was the end of the FY19 fiscal year. None of the 12 appropriations bills were passed, so Congress passed a continuing resolution until November 21st. And that also included an extension of the National Flood Insurance Program and the Export-Import Bank. The other dates here are January, which is when the second session of the 116th Congress reconvenes. February 1st, which is about the time that the president submits his budget to Congress. And then the middle of February, the delegation asks for our funding priorities. These are not earmarks. These are programmatic funding priorities for FY 2021. And then in March, the appropriations committees are supposed to begin marking up. They don't always adhere to that schedule. And then the end of the next federal fiscal year will be September 30th, 2020. So the Appropriations Committee's leadership is meeting tonight to figure out the duration of the next continuing resolution because still no appropriations bills have been passed. And it looks like, the next continuing resolution will continue funding at FY19 levels and until they finish all the appropriations bills. And they are apparently likely to extend it to December 20th. That's the word as of this morning. Considerations, as are on the slide, the potential shutdown or continuing resolution into the spring, and then the president's, one of the reasons we haven't reached any funding levels is the president's continued advocacy for the southern border wall funding. Next slide. So FY 2020 appropriations, which as we said have not yet been completed, conflicts over the southern border wall and partisan disputes on domestic spending levels have tied up the appropriations process. The biggest obstacle, as it was last year, previous year, was whether and how to fund the border wall. House Democrats provided no money for the project in their 2020 Homeland Security bill, while the Republican-controlled Senate Appropriations Committee provided President Trump requested $5 billion. When the federal FY2020 fiscal year began on October 1, none of the 12 appropriations bills had been passed, so a continuing resolution was approved. The House has passed 10 of its 12 appropriations bills. However, they will need to rewrite them as they go to conference with the Senate, as their non-defense spending limits exceed the spending limits that were set in the bipartisan budget deal enacted in August. They marked up prior to that budget deal. Meanwhile, at the beginning of this month, the Senate passed its first batch of spending bills. The package, known as a minibus, contained the FY20 Agriculture and FDA bill, the Interior and Environment bill, the Commerce Justice Science bill, which provides funding for the 2020 census, and the Transportation HUD bill, which contains the housing and homeless funding so important to Portland. These 4 bills will now move to conference with the House and will likely have full-year appropriations. The Senate tried to bring the defense and labor HHS bills to the floor as a package, but that failed. So as a result, Congress needs to extend the continuing resolution through December. What happens to the wall, the southern border wall, remains undecided at this point. A likely scenario might be a year-long continuing resolution for the Department of Homeland Security, or a potential partial government shutdown, which I think neither the House nor the Senate want, but might suit the president's purposes. Importantly, the continuing resolution also extended some expiring authorizations, such as the National Flood Insurance Program and the Export-Import Bank. The NFIP is now on its 13th short-term extension. The next continuing resolution will continue the NFIP program as well, because Congress will not be able to pass it in that time. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of a couple of these programs, where they are right now in the process, knowing that they haven't been completed yet. Under housing, the Home Partnership Program was at $1.3 billion in FY19. The House, of course, increased that a little bit because they marked up over the budget agreement, is at $1.75 billion, and the Senate is at $1.3 billion, so that will likely be level or slightly increased funding. The Community Development Block Grant was at $3.3 billion last year. The House marked up to 3.6. The Senate kept it level at 3.3. It'll probably be about 3.3. HUD-VASH, which is homeless program for veterans, $40 million last year, $40 million in both the House and the Senate, so it will be $40 million. And homeless assistance last year, $2.6 billion, but both the House and the Senate increased it a little bit, so it will likely be at $2.8 billion. On the transportation side, much of transportation funding comes as contract authority from the Highway Trust Fund and is not subject to annual appropriations, with some exceptions, such as the BUILD grants and the Capital Investment Program, which are New Starts, Small Starts Transit Program. The BUILD program was at $900 million in FY 2019. The House and the Senate both have it at $1 billion, a slight increase, so that will probably be the likely number. And the New Starts, Small Starts Program was at $2.25 billion in 2019. The House has it up a bit at 2.3. The Senate has it down a bit at 1.9, so it'll probably be about $2 billion. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, known as SAMHSA, is at $5.74 billion last year, $5.9 billion in the House, $3.7, quite a cut in the Senate. Hopefully, they will be able to get that number up in conference.
So what is the current level from the Senate?
From the Senate,
I guess from the Senate and the House. What was the current level in the last fiscal year?
$5.74 billion.
And so the Senate has actually proposed a
lower number.
40% cut
Yes.
in mental health and
Yeah.
addiction services. A
Yeah.
40% cut.
I
Based on what?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, Mayor.
Okay, so this is a real flashpoint for me.
I understand.
We're getting killed
Yes.
here
Yes.
on the lack of a safety net around addiction services and around the provision of mental health services. And so I feel like this needs to be moved up our list of priorities in terms of things we care deeply about. Because we're getting killed here
Okay.
at the local level. We need this support increased.
Well, we will
And
take
Portland's
that.
not unique in that regard,
We will take that message as soon as I get back to DC.
as will I.
Good.
Good.
The decennial census, the House is 7.5 billion, the Senate is 6.7 billion. There is a 1 billion carryover from 2019. The budget agreement that they agreed to in August adds 2.5 billion, and the continuing resolution has language for an anomaly for an accelerated spend rate of the census, which of course starts in January. The largest cost for 2020 census is the use of technology. Internet respondents are asked to use a portal to provide information which is expected should drive down the costs of enumerators. Next slide. Key issues for the year coming, the year ahead of us. On the FY 2021 budget and appropriations, theoretically, the FY21 appropriations process should be a bit smoother. One of the reasons the FY20 process was so delayed was that the House and Senate did not come to an overarching top-line number until their budget agreement in August. The beauty part is that this is a 2-year budget agreement, and so it staves off sequestration, the 10% across the board cuts, both defense and domestic, and it extended the debt limit until after the election. That takes several big stumbling blocks out of the way, but presumably wall funding will continue to be a divisive issue between Democrats and Republicans, as well as other partisan divides, which will only become more acute in a presidential election year. Transportation, surface transportation. After a brief moment of hope that there might be a large infrastructure package and agreement between the Democrats in the House and the President, that didn't happen. So now we turn to the regular order of a surface transportation reauthorization, which expires at the end of September 2020. The Senate has taken the lead and marked up what they are calling America's Transportation Infrastructure Act. Thus far, they have only revealed and marked up the highway portion of the bill, so transit, rail, and funding, the tax part of it will come later. It is a 5-year, $287 billion package for federal aid highway programs, which is a 27% increase over current levels. It continues highway formula programs, but it is also focused on bridge projects, climate, and resilience. It would create a competitive bridge program to replace and rehabilitate bridges such as the Burnside Bridge, a discretionary congestion relief program seeking multimodal solutions, a safety incentive program to advance things like our Vision Zero goals, a carbon reduction incentive program, a program for resiliency, and a program for disaster preparedness and response, for example, to the Cascadia subduction zone or in other things that we've been talking about. Finally, it repeals a $7.5 billion rescission in the current authorization, the FAST Act, that is due to occur July 1, 2020. And this is, when they created the FAST Act, they wanted it to fit within budget parameters, and so they put a rescission at the very end of the program. And people are working to try to rescind that rescission.
And what is that?
It's a rescission of highway funds, 7.5 billion highway funds from all the states. And this bill may advance to the Senate floor this year, if floor time allows, and the House will also reveal their surface transportation bill this year. The big question, as always, is how to pay for it, and it remains to be seen if Congress will have the fortitude to raise the gas tax in an election year, or engage in a broader conversation on new technologies-based revenues, such as the vehicle miles traveled. The National Flood Insurance Program. As I said, on its 13th short-term continuation, with less than 20 legislative days left in 2019, time is running out this year for anything except another short-term extension. The House Financial Services Committee advanced a flood insurance reauthorization measure, H.R. 3167, in June unanimously, 57-0 out of the committee. It is expected to get to the House floor by the end of the year. The Senate measure, S2187, has not yet been considered in committee. The House bill provides a 5-year reauthorization, creates an affordability demonstration program to offer premium discounts to low-income policyholders, increases funding for mapping and expands mapping, increases funding for mitigation assistance to policyholders and communities, and it targets resources to high-risk properties, expands opportunities for buyouts, and provides premium discounts to policyholders who make their structures more resilient. The Senate bill, also 5 years, caps annual increases at 9%, creates a new oversight for write-your-own policies, which apparently were a problem after Hurricane Sandy, and provides vouchers for low and middle-income house owners and renters. It is hoped that the program can be reauthorized next year, and we will be very closely involved in the reauthorization. Tax extenders. The Senate Finance Committee is eyeing the next short-term continuing resolution as a vehicle to also carry a tax extenders package that would give 30-plus expired and expiring tax credits new life. Many of the expired provisions are from 2017 and are related to renewable energy, such as the solar tax credit. The House has a much broader and more expensive extender package that they are working on. The success of an extender package will be dependent on Congress being able to pay for the bill. Of special importance to the city is the New Markets Tax Credit, an economic development tool for low-income areas which expires at the end of this year. It is this New Markets Tax Credit supports the work of the Portland Community Investment Fund. The New Markets Tax Credit has bipartisan support in Congress, but the administration is non-committal on the renewal of that. Administrative rules and regulations, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, the administration has been proposing rules on a variety of topics, including rolling back the Endangered Species Act, the public charge, changes to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and a host of other regulations, many of which affect immigrants. The city has commented on many of these proposed rules and has joined litigation in some instances. We expect this to be a continuing trend. Just on Friday, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services proposed a rule that would raise citizenship fees over 60% for most applications, and for the first time would require asylum seekers to pay a fee. So we expect these sorts of rules to continue to be proposed, and in many cases, they will be resolved in the courts, and we will continue to address them with the city providing comments when appropriate.
Can you give us a sense of the fees charged to asylum seekers? How much are we talking?
I think it's about, to asylum seekers, I don't know actually how much they're proposing.
Okay.
Right now.
Just
I have
curious.
it
Thank you.
here.
Could you find out and let us know?
I will, absolutely. I don't want to guess. On impeachment, finally, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, the House has opened an official impeachment inquiry, and tomorrow we will see the first of several witnesses to testify publicly on the Ukraine matter. Conventional wisdom holds that the House will vote to impeach and that the Senate will not convict. It is certain that this will distract Congress from completing the appropriations process and other regular legislative business, but how it ends is beyond the limits of my crystal ball. Before I turn it over to Niels Tillstrom to address the specifics of our FY 2020 federal agenda, I would like to commend our hardworking and well-placed congressional delegation who just are fantastic. And with that, I will turn it over to Niels Tillstrom, and thank you very much.
I just looked up, and it's the proposed fee for citizenship fees would go up to 1,170 from 725, and the asylum seekers $50 for applications and $490 for work permits.
Whoa.
Wow. Yeah.
So is that due and payable before you?
Before you can
How does that, so before you work, you have to pay the permit even if you're seeking asylum?
Yeah.
And then you can't get asylum unless you can work and be self-sufficient, so nice little circle.
Yeah, it seems punitive. All right, thank you.
Okay. Well, good morning, Mayor and
Morning.
Process too.
I'm going to try to be a little lighter. Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. My name is Niels Tillstrom, and I'm the Federal Relations Manager for the City of Portland. As Elizabeth mentioned, we're still in the 116th Congress, and the 2020 federal legislative and regulatory agenda is a refresh of the 2019 agenda with several instances of amended language and new policy positions. So on the drafts in front of you, we've highlighted in yellow those items that are have changes and that are new, and in the PowerPoint slides you have those, we put those items in italics. So I'm going to go through the priorities and policy positions, highlighting the items where we've made changes, and I'm happy to take questions at any time. So we've identified 8 priorities for 2020. The first 3 items advocate for increased federal investment in affordable housing, homelessness services, and mental health and addiction programs, recognizing that these issues are larger than can be truly met by local or state governments, and they need to be addressed on a federal scale. And as Vicki mentioned, there are some increases in appropriations for this year for housing programs, but as was pointed out, there is a large decrease in funding for mental health programs, especially on the Senate side. The city will advocate for community development block grant funding, the home partnerships program, the tenant protection vouchers, housing choice vouchers, emergency solutions grants, the housing opportunities for people living with AIDS program, and expansion of the low-income housing tax credit, and the Section 184 Indian Home Loan Guarantee Program. And the city will also push back against changes to the Fair Housing Rule and look for opportunities to influence regulation to create flexible uses for federal resources. We've made changes to the affordable housing item to include the need to align transit investments with investments in affordable housing, support the disparate impact rule of the Fair Housing Act, as well as advocate for the Equality Act. The next item is Portland is a growing, welcoming, inclusive, and sanctuary city, and it was developed with the Office of Community and Civic Life, focused on protecting Portland's sanctuary city values and working with our delegation to ensure that the 2020 decennial census process is fully funded and to ensure that everyone is counted and the process is not politicized. The following 4 items are focused on infrastructure and the environment, discussing resiliency and the authorization of the Surface Transportation Bill. Making a Resilient City was developed to ensure that the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management continues to receive funding through the ROSI program, as well as securing support for hazard and pre-disaster mitigation grants that the city may wish to apply for in 2020. We've added language here to reference support for the Emergency Management Performance Grant Program, which was a request from PBEM. The Portland Harbor Superfund site item is about continuing to educate the delegation and the EPA on city priorities within the Portland Superfund process and providing examples of current work that's already being accomplished with our partners. And we've updated this item to capture the current state of the process. Keeping Portland moving, as Vicki mentioned, the 116th Congress could be when we see the reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Program, which could include potential congressionally directed spending, which earmarks, as well as opportunities to enact policies that would benefit the city's transportation and climate goals, including an increase in the gas tax, removal of toll restrictions, and prioritization of our work as a Vision Zero city. And finally, the confronting climate change item. In Portland, as we know, Portland enacted its climate action plan over 25 years ago, and it's even more incumbent on cities to lead after the administration has initiated the process to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. And we've updated this item to reflect current emission data from BPS.
I think we need to just routinely refer to it as the climate crisis.
Okay.
Change sounds way too mild, like going to Mexico for Christmas.
One other item, I think per our earlier conversation, it sounds like under the investing in mental health and addiction services, we should go back and update the language around substance abuse and mental health service administration funding. So when we come back before you in December, before that time, we'll update that language as well to make sure we reflect the concerns about the reduction in the Senate funding.
Yes. So moving to policy positions, in addition to priority items, the city has identified policy positions in 4 policy themes, and they're provided in no specific order here: protecting local decision-making, investing in growing cities and their people, providing public safety, and addressing the needs of the environment and built infrastructure. And as with the priorities, except for a few amendments and additions, many of these items are the same as we worked on in 2019. So in observance of time, I can focus on those items where we've made amendments, but I'm happy to discuss any of them here. So on the first policy theme, protecting local decision-making, the item allying to protect tribal sovereignty and self-governance, we've revised this item to better reflect the interconnectedness of the work of the Federal Relations Program and the Tribal Relations Program. Next slide. With respect to the item opportunity zones, we've revised this language to emphasize the need for transparency in this program.
Jump in there for a second. I was at Senator Wyden's town hall on Saturday, and he was sharply critical of opportunity zones, said he had legislation that he was working on or had brought forth, felt that it was a giveaway to wealthy interests and was not working as intended. I didn't catch the whole spiel, but what do we know about his concerns, and how might that shape opportunity zones going forward?
So, Commissioner, last week, Senator Wyden introduced the Opportunity Zone Reporting and Reform Act, S 2787, and it requires all qualified opportunity funds to provide information on assets, investors, and types of investments to the IRS. This includes the amount of investment and the value of the Opportunity Zone stock, partnership interests, and business property held by the fund, as well as the value of tangible and intangible property. It redesignates zones that are not low income. Previously, the law permitted states to designate low-income adjacent communities to opportunity zones. It clarifies opportunity zone rules, and it requires the Government Accountability Office to report on the effectiveness of the opportunity zone program. And we sent to the city last Friday, I think, the legislation and a summary of it.
Okay, so you mentioned transparency. Does that capture his concerns?
It captures his concerns, yes, the senator's concerns.
Thank you.
So in continuing in this policy theme, we've made 2 more changes. Support for access to legal services was focused on the Legal Services Corporation. We've revised this language to also call out the need for right to counsel for rent-burdened households, and this was a request from the Portland Housing Bureau. And then additionally, we've added a new item providing for digital equity, which was a request of the Office of Community Technology. And this item is regarding seeking funding and assistance to ensure the access to the internet and technology for all those who need it. The next slide is providing for public safety. We've added a new item, gun violence prevention. This new language will enable us to better advocate for gun violence prevention legislation, including background checks. We've amended the domestic violence prevention language to reflect coordination with the Tribal Relations Program. And we've amended the federal cannabis regulation item to expressly support the Safe Banking Act. And then next slide, with the last policy theme, addressing the needs of the environment and built infrastructure, the National Flood Insurance Program in compliance with Endangered Species Act item has been revised to reflect the current status of the National Flood Insurance biological opinion process. And then in addition to that, the last 2 items, Water Research Foundation and the Peak Flows Management Rule, are 2 new items. The Water Research Foundation is language that supports the appropriation of a program that benefits the Portland Water Bureau. And the peak flow management rule is new language on the impact of a non-site specific rule that could require BES to treat wastewater in a way that could adversely impact the Bureau's current practices, which meet current standards at this point.
So I have two questions. Mayor, under addressing the needs of the environment and built infrastructure, where does our work to secure funding for WRDA projects fall?
So that language is contained within the Willamette River Restorations Project. And we have, we've actually included.
I'm sorry, where is that on your?
It is the second item in addressing the needs of the environment and built infrastructure.
I see. So that.
And I apologize, I should have pointed that out. We've actually revised that language to specifically call out the coordination we've done with the Tribal Relations Program as it relates to Lamprey.
Okay, and I can't remember what WRDA stands for, but it's Water
Resources Development Act.
And we're hoping that there's some money that gets into the appropriations bill?
Yes, correct. It would be the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill, which is not yet passed the Senate floor, but there is committee report language that addresses environmental restoration needs.
Okay, so that's covered. And then, colleagues, I'd like to make a pitch to move flood insurance from a policy position to a priority. And let me just read some brief comments. The National Flood Insurance Program, administered by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, is currently out of compliance with the Endangered Species Act. Portland has a number of species listed under the ESA, including salmon and steelhead populations. The city is pursuing a compliance plan in cooperation with FEMA and the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NIMFS, and that not only meets regulatory requirements, but also fulfills policies in the city's comprehensive plan and climate action plan, and around emergency preparedness, watershed health, equity, and housing. FEMA was granted a 3-year extension by Congress, which lasts until 2021. The city is using that extension to carefully tailor a compliance plan. We believe, and that's, when I say we, I'm talking about the Bureau of Environmental Services and our partners, believe it is important that we advocate for this, as additional federal resources will help with restoration work to achieve improved outcomes for salmon and steelhead in the floodplain. And it will help minimize impact on homeowners and business owners in the floodplain. So with that, we'd like to make at least a pitch and get your feedback for moving that particular program from a policy to a priority.
Commissioner Fish, I'd like to second that and acknowledge that this is a very important issue, and I'm glad you noted that there is work underway in the city of Portland to put forward a compliance plan, and it will be consistent with the city codes, and as you mentioned, the climate action plan, as well as the 2035 plan, as well as some of the other work we're doing around housing and accessibility and other issues. And it is good that FEMA has extended the rate structure conversations. My understanding, Elizabeth, they extended it to 2021. So we're not under the same pressure we were under even fairly recently. But I trust that Commissioner Fish and the team at BES will continue to work towards a compliant structure, and that they'll keep both government relations and us in the loop. But I would be supportive of your ask to the council.
What's your feedback on that, just generally?
I think this is one of an issue we bring to the delegation regularly. The local staff is well briefed on this, and I think raising the profile, because there's been some concerns at the congressional level about both the change in the rate structure, the speed in which FEMA wanted to pursue that, and then also a programmatic biological opinion on the National Flood Insurance compliance with the Endangered Species Act. I think moving that up into policy or into a priority would signal to our delegation that we take this work very seriously.
So Mayor, that would be my hope that we could elevate it.
What is, under priorities, Portland is a growing, welcoming, inclusive, and sanctuary city. How does that translate to federal dollars or something?
Before we answer that, is there any objection to Commissioner Fish's ask that we elevate? Okay, great. Thank you.
so noted.
So the flood insurance rate structure.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And thanks for your great work on WRDA.
I want to make sure everybody.
You know, someday it'll be a, if we get the funding that, and I apologize because my colleague has the floor, but if we get the funding that's in the pipeline for Tryon Creek, and then as many as 4 or 5 other projects in the pipeline, there'll be a time in the future we will look back on a body of work that is really outstanding. And there are many parts of our relationship with the federal government which are fractured right now, but we have a superb working relationship with the Army Corps of Engineers. And we're grateful for Senator Merkley for being our champion for the funding for that program.
Good catch. So Commissioner Hardesty's question.
Yes. So under the Portland is a growing, welcoming, inclusive, and sanctuary city, the focus on that is broadly about immigration reform, but also about opposing administrative actions that limit eligibility for federal funding based on a sanctuary city or sanctuary jurisdiction status. It also includes our work on the 2020 Census, which then impacts those funds that are coming back to the city in order to provide services for folks.
So do we not want to say that this is about immigration and census? Because this doesn't say anything. The Portland is a growing, welcoming, inclusive, and sanctuary city. And the priority is protecting immigrant and refugees' right to
Yeah, so on page 3 of the draft agenda, it does mention comprehensive immigration reform.
But I think what I'm hearing from the commissioner is just to be more explicit in how we call out the
I
priority.
just think that we shouldn't hide who we are,
Yeah.
right? If we say that we are protecting immigrants' rights, then we should actually say it. And the same with the census, that we value counting every person, because we do, right? So,
Well, it does. It says Portland is a stronger city because of the people who have immigrated here, and the city recognizes that immigrant and refugee communities contribute significantly to the workforce, economy, neighborhoods, and culture of Portland. The city has the obligation to ensure that individuals are welcomed and valued. And then
well, which one of these actually go to the federal delegation?
This one.
the whole thing.
No.
This is just like the summary for us in public.
We're happy to go back
so
and.
that was one question.
So Commissioner, if you want different language and on page 3, in the past I've found that government relations is more than happy to entertain amendments. That's why we have a work session and put it out for public comment, and sometimes the public comes in and says, make this stronger as well. Sorry, next question.
Thank you. I would recommend that we say Portland is a sanctuary city, and we value counting all for the census or something of that effect. I don't like when we hide behind words that don't really say much about who we are. So are there attacks on tribal governments taking place in DC now? Are we hearing about, because on page 10 of the slide, it says allying to protect tribal sovereignty and self-governance?
In short, yes. There have been attacks on the Indian Child Welfare Act, on different funding mechanisms, and on sovereignty more broadly. And so this is an item where we are identifying opportunities for allyship for the city in order to support sovereign tribal governments.
And so that would be what would that look like in action?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it is advocating for language as part of the Violence Against Women's Act that targets funding to tribal communities, domestic violence prevention, money that would go to tribal communities. We talk about our work with respect to restoration and how it can highlight some of the natural resources that the tribal communities rely on. We've amended language in here to include reference to lamprey, which is important to our tribes. There are references to Indian home loan programs as that was part of the BIA. There are a number of different parts. I think this is sort of this item is the hub in which a lot of spokes come off of it into different pieces of the agenda. And Laura, John, and I work daily in order to figure out where those different spokes can touch our work, and it becomes shared work.
Thank you. And my last question has to do with opportunity zones. Has any opportunity been presented by opportunity zones thus far?
Yeah, I think the showcase, for better or worse, in downtown Portland is the new hotel that's going in where there used to be food carts.
Oh, the luxury hotel?
Correct.
That's not, that's an opportunity for some folks, but.
Well, that explains why Senator Wyden has put in a bill, because this was part of the Republican tax code changes, and he has concerns that we have about where the benefits are going and how it's structured, and I think it's along the lines of what you were just picking up on.
And didn't new market tax credits go away?
It's going away at the end of this year. So currently, they're in the last round of seeking projects for that.
Well, let's just be clear, though. It's not only downtown that's in the opportunity zones. It's also Airport Way, Gateway, and Rosewood. So there are.
I thought your question was what project?
Yeah, what opportunities have been presented?
At this point is the new hotel.
Well, no, I think we've maybe I'm confusing this with the enterprise zones, but we've had a lot of them in the central,
Enterprise
in this,
Yes, but not
Okay.
opportunity. Opportunity zone is all downtown.
and
All
Gateway,
downtown.
Airport Way,
And
and
not-
Rosewood.
The opportunity zones, there are opportunity zones, as the commissioner stated, Airport Way, or Rosewood, and Gateway. Those were highlighted and nominated by the governor's office. But the problem, as Commissioner Fish stated, is that we're not able to track the money that's going into those zones. And so unless we're told explicitly or unless we are the ones who are investing. So Senator Wyden's bill would sort of put in place requirements for those.
There were no legislative strictures on the opportunity zone, so no reporting requirements.
Yeah.
So that's why.
No reporting
There
requirements?
are no reporting requirements in the legislation. The Treasury Department about 3 weeks ago came out with some reporting requirements. Senator Cory Booker and Senator Tim Scott, who were the original sponsors of the legislation, have legislation out there as well to require some reporting requirements. And then we have Senator Wyden's bill. So that they're trying to go back and fix that so that we know what's going on in our city.
I'm curious, colleagues, has the governor ever in the past actually submitted a proposal without talking to the people who would be impacted by it?
Well,
I mean,
that
'cause
was
what
the
I heard
entire
about-
legislative session last time, wasn't it? It was.
I'm sorry?
I found that was the experience for the entire legislative session last year, that there was lots of decisions made without talking to the people impacted.
I'm troubled by that because I understand it was a short timeline and,
Yeah.
but still, I haven't talked to anybody from the governor's office yet.
My understanding for how the process worked around the nomination of opportunity zones was that the actual neighborhoods or not parcels, is it Census tract or Census tract, directly reached out to the governor's office, and she had requests from all across the state. She made a selection and then put her top items forward as proposed opportunity zones.
Last question. Under the page 12, providing public safety, are all those programs money that comes annually to the police bureau?
There are programs that no. So the Department of Justice grants are grants that flow to the Police Bureau. Department of Homeland Security grant programs are accessed by the Portland Fire Bureau and Portland Bureau of Emergency Management.
You know, when I see public safety, I think police, and I don't know if other people think that, but maybe first responders would be a more appropriate heading.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Except some of it is also about gun violence and domestic violence and things
Well,
like that.
yeah, I mean, I'm not saying, police are first responders, but they're not, public safety implies that it's just police, and I think first responders broadens the definition so that it's covering Bureau of Emergency Management and some of the other programs.
I think reasonable people can agree or disagree on this. I will tell you that we define public safety at the city very broadly to include much more than police. And at budget time, when people are advocating for enhanced fire services and other kinds of services, I think they understand it. It goes beyond. So I don't have a dog in this fight, but I think first responders unduly narrows the scope of what we're talking about. And I think public safety at the city historically has been all of our, I mean, you have 2 or 3 of them that report to you. 3. So 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
For me, public safety says police. That's all it says. And if it's broader than that, then we should find another term. Maybe it's not first responders, but
We could
when I
find,
talk to people on the street, people, when you say public safety, they're thinking cops. They're not thinking first responders.
Well, that was what we experienced when we were discussing the cannabis tax appropriations, right? When they said 80% was public safety, that was because they were including half of that was for traffic safety for traffic Division 0 and not for the traffic division. So yes, I agree that it's a problem. I'm not sure whether it's triggering to people in the federal government the same way it is locally.
Yeah, I don't know how they think.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, this is something where we could say supporting first responders and providing public safety. We could amend the language to be therefore more inclusive by adding that in there, if that would better reflect the council's desire.
Thank you. That sounds better.
Okay. Anything else on the draft federal legislative and regulatory agenda?
The only thing I would add, and I know I'm sounding like I'm a broken record on this, I would encourage us to be far more aggressive in the partnerships we have with other cities, particularly the West Coast cities that are being buried by the homeless crisis, and the funding that we must have around addiction treatment and mental health services. And I look at where Congress's priorities are today, and I look at the needs of this community and the needs of other large cities around the United States, but predominantly on the West Coast, and they are not aligned. We need to align them. And I'm also trying to figure out how, in the context of a presidential election cycle, we make some noise together with other jurisdictions and elevate these issues, because it seems year after year we keep ignoring the reality that we have collectively in this country a failed safety net around addiction services and addiction treatment and mental health services. And I just wonder, how much longer are we going to go on ignoring this problem? It has to be, from my perspective, when I go to DC, this is all I'm going to talk about. This is my highest priority. And I just, when I look at the legislative juice the West Coast has collectively, we have a lot more than we're exerting currently on this issue.
Well, Mayor, I think there's also two other elephants in the room we should acknowledge. One is that our president has written off most of the cities that have these homeless
That's correct.
crises. West Coast and East Coast cities, so he's not running to our rescue. But the second thing is, and shame on us on this point, Mayor, I'll give you $1 for every time homelessness or mental health crisis has been framed as an issue of concern in the Democratic debates. Here we have, a unique field of former and current mayors. Unique. Actually, former, current mayors, a former head of HUD. I mean, we have a unique field. How is it that this particular issue, which our people tell us is top of the line, number one issue, it's the same in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, all up and down the coast. How come that doesn't warrant a single question in a town hall with people seeking the Democratic nomination for president? So we've got these two elephants in the room, and it continues to be distressing to me that we can defend over $200 billion of investments in things like the mortgage interest deduction, and I'm not here to pick a fight with the mortgage interest deduction, but it's the cost to the federal government is over $200 billion. And yet we expend a paltry $40 or so billion a year on all these programs to help folks that don't have any housing. Seems quite out of whack. And maybe we need an intervening election to call that question.
So in terms of building alliances, the League of Oregon Cities did put mental health and addictions funding high on the agenda last time. Do we need to do something at the December board meeting to get them all to do the same thing this year? Or how does that work?
The League of Oregon Cities will kick off its agenda-setting process. It sets an agenda every 2 years.
Okay, so that's still on their list then?
It's still on that list.
So we advocate on behalf of the county in terms of them getting the mental health resources from the state, because that's the way it works here. That's the flow of funds from the state to the county, and then the county and the city work together. Mm-hmm. How did we do in the last Oregon legislative session with regard to mental health dollars?
And I may need to phone a friend for the exact dollar figure. I know that over the last couple cycles, we have increased housing dollars precipitously by increasing the document recording fee and directing more money into the emergency housing account and the state homeless assistance program, which funds shelter space. One of the items that you'll see on the draft state legislative agenda is trying to close a gap of about $9 million that was not included for community mental health, that was sort of left off the table, and we're seeking to close that gap in the short term and increase overall mental health funding.
So
long
my
run.
point was not intended to be settled. It was
Yeah.
reduced.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
It was reduced.
Yes.
So the same argument that I'm making with regard to the federal government, we need to make to the state legislature. Nobody's going to advocate in our absence for more services for people with addiction and mental health if we do not do it ourselves. So we have to do it, along with those others in the League of Cities and those in the counties who care about this issue. Because the fact of the matter is we lost in the last legislative session, particularly on the mental health side. And is there anybody here who disputes that we have a growing problem in this community and in this state? Nobody does. So we need to fight harder and more aggressively and be louder about it, and we need to work better with our partners. I know you've done a great job with the League of Cities, and I appreciate that because I hear the feedback. But we got to do something differently here.
Well, the other thing I think we need to do is to particularly talk to Senator Wyden, and also former Senator Gordon Smith, who were both at the National Alliance on Mental Illness dinner and then went on either Straight Talk or Your Vote, talking about their own personal experience. And it would seem, I know you cultivated a good relationship with Senator Smith when he was in office, and it would seem like that would be a really, they need to hear the desperation in the mayor's voice, my voice, everybody else's voice, that this is a crisis. And in the past, Senator Smith, when he was in office, was able to champion it because of his own personal experience. And I would hope that Senator Wyden would as well.
Do we know why that $9 million was not included in the county's budget? during the last legislative session?
Let's get to the state.
Yeah, maybe that's a good,
Good segue.
What I just keep hearing is that it was just they forgot. They were busy on something else, which to me is a little insanity. Oh, good.
Why don't we shift? Is there anything else on the federal agenda? Vicki, thank you for your great leadership, and Niels, thank you for your great leadership. You guys
Thank
are a
you.
great team, and we appreciate your representation in DC. All right, Elizabeth.
all right, here we go, transitioning to state. I'm going to call up Stacy Cowan, our State Government Relations Manager, and Eric Knoll, our state lobbyist, to talk about the draft 2020 state legislative agenda, and Haley gets to stay.
I want to do a time check
Yeah.
also, just to see how
Yeah,
it's about
we
10:40.
have 50 minutes.
All right, good.
If you would like, we can jump straight to that question, or we can go through the lay of the land as before. Happy to be flexible.
Well, I don't think we need all the
Yeah.
preamble for the state. 'Cause
Yeah.
we're kind of closer to that.
Yeah. So we'll just go through it a little bit of a faster clip on the background to get to discussion more
Good,
quickly.
thank you.
You know, we're going into a short session. It's a sprint. It's 35 days. We're likely going to see roughly 275 bills. You contrast that with a long session, which is 160 days and approximately 2,800 bills. So it's a very different setting. Nowadays, with short sessions, we're dealing with a finite universe. House members get 2 bills, senators get 1, committees get 3, the governor gets 5. And again, contrasting with a long session, when you have basically a free-for-all for the number of concepts you want up until a certain date when there's a cutoff. So it makes this very different environment when seeking out vehicles for potential legislation. And unlike the city, the state budget's on a 2-year cycle, as you all know. So we're not going to be in a budgeting year in the short cycle. We started developing the 2020 draft agenda back in August when we sent out issue sheets just shortly after the close of the long legislative session. Unlike the federal agenda, this one was built largely from scratch. Not that there's not a large category of unfinished business or other carryovers of important themes for the city, but because it's a new legislative session with new bills, it is a new agenda. Since August, we've been working with our liaisons, city attorney's office, council offices, subject matter experts and bureaus in order to research and vet the concepts for inclusion in this draft. We've also been meeting with key legislators, both in our delegation and around the state. And we've been talking with other governments and stakeholders as part of further vetting, coalition building, and better understanding the lay of the land. Can't stress the importance of coalition building at the federal level. I think that actually not just as our federal legislative agenda, but also our national agenda and how we partner with other cities. That same strategy happens at the state level. One other item just about how we've been talking with clients and sort of advising through this process. Because a short session is a sprint, and the first chamber deadline, or the first cutoff for bills is a week and a half into session. We let folks know that the most successful concepts are typically things that are well vetted, things that are in the category of unfinished business, that are technical but not complex, that are nonpartisan or sort of apolitical. So that's sort of the generalized advice about a short session. Obviously, that doesn't apply to all issues. So the next slide is a snapshot of the timeline between now and 4 months from now when session is over. The dates that are in italics are legislative items, and city items are in regular font. Next week, we'll be back in Salem for interim committee days, and that's when committees will convene. They'll discuss issues that are reporting back from last session or that they're considering for next session. Also next week, we will be holding our Community Legislative Information Night at PCC's Cascade Campus. This is an annual event that's the result of Commissioner Fritz's leadership and with the support of her office and Community and Civic Life and Office of Equity and Human Rights. We'll be putting on an event that both teaches community members how to be better advocates at the state along with a panel of state legislators and advocates. So it's a nice conversation. And following the educational segment, we'll have a community forum where attendees will be able to share their input on issues that they really care about at the state and issues that impact them and take a look at the city's draft agenda. And we'll be joined by Mayor Wheeler, Commissioner Fritz, and Commissioner Hardesty next Tuesday. And just to assure you, input from the forum will be distributed back to your offices well in advance of the December 12th date when we come back before you with both the state and federal agendas for hopeful approval at that point in time.
So if 3 members of council are present, does that turn that into a public meeting that has to be televised?
We can take careful minutes, and
Sorry?
we can take careful minutes, and we've posted it on the notables calendar in order to notice it.
But in the past, hasn't it simply been the mayor and Commissioner Fritz?
Yes. Yeah, this is the first time we've had a quorum present. And so we'll be distributing those meetings to council and to the auditor's office as well.
Is the 2020 state legislative agenda that we have now, unlike the federal agenda you gave us that has a lot of highlighting
Yep.
in yellow?
Yep.
Is the absence of highlighting meaning that we're essentially recycling our existing agenda items?
No, Commissioner, this is in fact, imagine the whole thing is in yellow. So
Okay.
it is, we start whole cloth
Okay.
on the state side. And in part, that's because at the federal level, because Congress meets in a 2-year cycle, you have the same bills that are alive from the first session to the second session.
Right.
Whereas at the close, sine die of the long session, everything dies off and we have a new universe.
Well,
for the
certainly
short
local
session.
decision-making
Yes.
is a standard.
Yep.
In other words, we object to any preemption. And in that regard, are we, once again, absolutely locked down, confirmed that the lift preemption bill will not come up in the short session?
Commissioner, we've heard varying reports. Based on early advocacy, we have been assured, but, you know, it's constant vigilance is important, that a concept like that would not move forward. One may be introduced. And there is going to be a longer work group process that Representative Susan McLean is initiating in order to discuss the wide array of issues that come up around transportation network companies.
Well, the speaker specifically told me recently it would not be decided in this short session. So that's the current information we have. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And are we part of the work group?
Yes.
And we're looking at potentially another option, which is to create a floor so that rather than a preemption?
That's correct. Yeah, and actually looking more broadly at the issue around preemption, which was a major onslaught during the last long session, we saw more efforts at preempting than we had during my entire time with the city. The concept of a floor and then allowing some standardization at the state level, but allowing local governments to go further is something that actually tests really well with voters as well, when we've looked at sort of national polling on issues around preemption.
Thank you.
So we'll be back on December 12th. We'll be taking your feedback over the course of this work session, the community forum next week, and any additional comments from bureaus or your offices, and circulating fresh copies, and hopefully have a final version on December 12th of both the state and federal agendas. Looking ahead to the new year, we'll have our Portland Delegation Legislative Breakfast in January, and we'll then be back in Salem for organizational days on the 13th through the 15th. That is likely when we'll start to see bills, actual bills for the short session, although the short session doesn't start until February 3rd.
Elizabeth, the legislative breakfast that we do is one of the highlights of the year. In recent breakfasts, however, there have been a number of issues which our state legislators did not raise during the breakfast that had an impact on Portland that we found out about afterwards. How do we encourage full transparency at that breakfast of issues that relate to the city so we don't get blindsided later?
Start later and have more protein. I think it's, kidding aside, having some pre-meetings with our leadership, because we have a lot of leadership in the Portland area, and trying to make sure that we have a high level of trust and that we can help create a safer space for those conversations about both identifying and highlighting and issue spotting areas where we're going to have major concerns, and having it be an area where we can openly debate what the trade-offs are when local government authority is traded away for, let's say, a corporate interest at the end of the day. And while a state legislator may consider that a good short-term game plan, it is really detrimental in the long term, and helping to tell that story about why it's so detrimental. So,
Well, Elizabeth, I think we just have to tell them when we are disappointed that they either push stupid legislation or they aren't championing the stuff that they tell us that they're going to champion. I mean, they won't know it unless we tell them. So I think it's on us to actually have that conversation at our legislative breakfast.
yeah. And to make sure that we hold folks accountable and say, we were very clear, and these are the negative repercussions, right? And this is the impact of that at the end of the day.
So could you answer Commissioner Hardesty's question from earlier about what happened with mental health funding?
Yeah. Yeah, don't forget to.
Good morning, Commissioner. We were going to touch on this in a minute, but my understanding of the $9 million, so the legislature created a budget note. They created a budget package. They created a budget note directing the county and community partners, county partners, to participate in a work group, and the discussion was around caseload. So there was significant disagreement about how caseload formulas were created, and the direction was to do the work group process, and that once that would be complete, then that $9 million would be available. You'll see language reflected in your current draft to support that request, with the recognition that that $9 million is simply just a matter of filling the current gap from the current biennium, and that it by no means meets the full need for community-based mental health services. So it's a short session. It's not a budget-making session, so it's about getting those remaining dollars that were left on the table and continuing to have the conversation of the existing need. I'm happy to get more details. I didn't participate in the work group, but my understanding is it really revolved around making sure that the caseload formula was not unnecessarily disincentivizing services. But I'm happy to follow up with more additional information if you'd like.
And so is the work group done?
Mike's not on.
Is the work group done with its work?
I'm not familiar with the exact timeline. My understanding is the work group will be completed by the time session convenes.
Thank you.
But the fact remains, the funding is still grossly inadequate even with the $9 million.
Exactly. Not to mention the fact that I guess they expect people who need services to just hang out until the next session starts, huh?
Actually, it goes, I think the problem goes beyond what's being discussed now, because it's not just the county mental health systems, it's the private system as well, where people with insurance, in fact, I was told recently that it's actually easier for people who are on the Oregon Health Plan going through the county to get services in a timely manner than it is for people using private insurance. That's just ridiculous. Not that I'm begrudging people getting their services, but you know, it's just, they're not addressing, I mean, it's really frustrating to hear that they were arguing about caseloads when, you know, it's rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Which is why the downtown mental health drop-in clinic is so key to the work that we have to do here in Multnomah County. And I don't know if there are state dollars to assist with that. But I do think when we talk about the needs of mental health, that drop-in center is critical to the work that we're doing here in the city of Portland. And without that, we're going to be really bad off.
It's a piece. It will mostly serve people who live outside, and as we've seen with Unity, the Unity Centre, the needs are so much greater than any one or two or three clinic or drop-in areas can manage, particularly when people who have primary care providers but can't get to see them for 2 months are then spiraling and getting into crisis.
Right. Well, I mean, we do have to put it back on our hospitals who thought once Unity came online that their mental health services were no longer necessary for those in need. So I think it is a broader conversation because we have a lot of people walking around with health care, with a health care card, but no health care.
Yeah.
And that's a problem.
Well, the Unity Centre didn't expand the number of beds, it only just moved them all into one place.
Not you. You're just a messenger. We're not trying to kill the messengers.
Professional messengers. But this conversation is really important to be having in a public forum and in this context too, because these are messages that we will be taking and with your assistance, pushing forward at frankly every level, because it's something that's far beyond what we can do here. I'll quickly clip through. The next slide says we have strong Democratic majorities in both chambers. You have the same leadership in the Senate. You have Tina Kotek remaining the Speaker, but you have new Democratic and Republican leaders on the House side. So Barbara Smith Warner replaced Jennifer Williamson as the majority or Democratic leader, and Christine Drazen replaced Carl Wilson as the Republican leader. There are supermajorities in both chambers. That's the threshold necessary for revenue-raising measures. I'd note that both chambers are 2 votes shy of the 2/3 threshold for quorum with a single party, and that became an issue last session given the 2 Senate walkouts. So that's that snapshot. I'll skip the next slide. And I'll turn things over to Eric to talk about, this is the snapshot of where we landed in 19. We've already started to talk about some of these items, but it's sort of the wins, losses, and carry forwards.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. For the record, Eric Knoll, State Lobbyist with the Office of Government Relations. I'll be providing a brief review of the city's legislative priorities from the 2019 session, covered on slides 19 and 20 of the presentation, before we step in and start looking forward toward 2020. I will say additional detail is available in our 2019 State Legislative Report, which was distributed in September to all liaisons and council offices, and the link to the report is available on our Government Relations webpage. And the review of the 2020 session includes many wins, but it also includes some significant unfinished business. We were just talking about mental health and addiction. That's one of those areas. Much of this unfinished business will overlap with our draft 2020 state legislative agenda, and Stacey will cover that in a few minutes. But I want to start by talking a little bit about affordable and stable housing, and highlight that by the end of the first month of the session, the legislature, through Senate Bill 608, passed a historic tenant protections bill establishing a statewide rent stabilization policy and a just cause eviction standard. Also, the city introduced and passed a bill extending the sunset date on the multiple unit limited tax exemption, also known as the multi program, by 10 years to 2032. As you know, multi is a key incentive used in conjunction with the city's inclusionary housing program. Significant investments through the budget process were also made in housing and housing development, including $50 million in general obligation bonds to support the development of new permanent supportive housing statewide, and $50 million in funding for the Emergency Housing Account State Homeless Assistance Program and shelter services, including $40 million of ongoing funding in that area. Now, turning to mental health and addiction, do want to acknowledge that when we talk about mental health and addiction, we're talking about a system that has been chronically underfunded and underserved. And so what I want to highlight here really ends up being a little bit of a silver lining set against the backdrop of the mental health and addiction crises we're facing in our communities. We did see that the Oregon Health Authority budget included a $31.6 million new package for behavioral health investments, focused on crisis and transition services, school-based mental health consultation, treatment services, and others. Setting this against the larger backdrop of the session, much of the focus around mental health, while it didn't establish new funding for community mental health, focused on conversations around the state hospital, as well as mental health in schools through, for example, the Student Success Act and some of the investments that will be coming out of that bill. The legislature also allocated $6 million in the budget reconciliation bill at the end of session for community mental health programs, the same program Stacy was talking about, and the $9 million set aside for the short session. This $6 million allocation effectively bridged from June through February so that the program technically would not lose funding below current service level. It did not add new funding, but it created that bridge to at least give that work group time to come into the short session and have a conversation about that formula prior to reinvesting that $9 million that was set aside, as Stacy referenced. A couple other bills of note: House Bill 2257, coming out of the governor's opioid epidemic task force. It declared substance use disorder a chronic illness and had multiple components aimed at improving the continuum of care and access to quality treatment for people experiencing substance use disorder. Much of that focused on pilot programs and studies, though it did not make substantial new investments. And then finally, yes?
Why not? I mean, there's been so much said about Oregon being somewhere in the nation of about fourth in terms of dealing with addiction. So we are a highly addicted state. And depending upon whose numbers you believe, we're somewhere in the high 40s, I think 46, 47, 48, somewhere there in terms of access to addiction treatment. Is it that the legislature doesn't see any strategy by way of funding that, or is it just not a priority? Why do we continually, year after year, find ourselves passing status quo budgets around addiction services? What's going on?
And that's a very good question.
I mean, surely they care. I don't think they're uncaring people. So what's going on?
What I'll start by is setting this against the backdrop of the state budget process, kind of writ large. In my experience and understanding, the coalitions that have the strongest and most unified voice tend to be the most successful in the state budget process. And my observation in the last couple of sessions, while the issues around addiction and mental health have been elevated, the coalitions around that and the advocacy groups have not necessarily had a unified message or a singular coalesced strategy in the state budget process. So when you have, for example, 800 bills get referred to Ways and Means to the tune of multiple billions of dollars above what the state has to spend, the groups that have that most coalesced voice are going to be the most successful. And I think historically, the groups that support additional investments in mental health and addiction have not had that same framework.
So I think it's important that, I realize the short legislative session is sort of a quick and dirty and done. Mm-hmm. But for the next full session, we need a strategy. And it has to be a collective strategy, and we have to have a coalition in place, and we have to make an all-hands-on-deck push to prioritize this. Because I'll tell you, we're spending a lot of money in every other area as a result of our failure to address addiction and mental health issues. And
Mayor, I totally agree. And there really hasn't been a robust roadmap to date. You'll have a particular champion come forward and push something, and then they'll move on to something else. But to have a broad-based coalition talking about all of the other areas where we're spending a lot of resources in order to compensate for the area where we're not spending resources will be a really important thing to push and push early. The governor created a behavioral health advisory council to address serious mental illness, but it was created on October 24th. So it's in its sort of seedling stage. I think that's an area where we can get involved in addition to just doing broad-based, more aggressive advocacy. And some of what Eric was talking about was specifically focused on opioids. And we know that there are more than just opioids that are causing a problem with addiction in our community. And so needing to take that broader approach will be really important.
Well, I just find it sort of a fascinating case study in politics, because this is all I hear from my constituents all day long. They're energized, they're focused, they're motivated, and they're madder than hell.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder how we translate that anger and that frustration, which, by the way, is completely justifiable. How do we translate that into real action at the state level? And by extension, working with other cities around the country, extend it to the federal level.
And I would hope.
We need to shake the tree loose.
Yep. We have, I think last count was somewhere around 28 state legislators that have at least some small tidbit of Portland within their district.
But it's not just a Portland problem.
No,
I mean,
but these are shared
I can't go to any
constituents.
community in this state where somebody doesn't say, what are you guys doing about homelessness? We have a homeless crisis. What are you guys doing about addiction? What are you guys doing about the inaction around mental health? This is not a Portland-centric issue. It is rapidly becoming a national issue, but it's worse here than in other areas because we are the largest urban center.
And building on some of the work that was done at League of Oregon Cities and the Homelessness Symposium, I think a year and a half ago, that is a good foundation to push other cities who may not think of it as their issue in Oregon, and to have that acknowledgement, right? Because that's not always the case.
Well, nobody wants it to be their issue. Let's be clear about this. This is the hot potato. Nobody wants to sign up to acknowledge and accept and take ownership of homelessness. I do. But I don't sense the urgency yet elsewhere. And so you made a really good point about coalition building, having a consistent message, going in unified. And I think about all of the players here in this community that are highly activated around these issues. We need to leverage the partnerships we already have in place and the coalition we have here. We need to figure out how do we leverage that into accomplishing what we need to accomplish in our statewide agenda, as opposed to what really happened in the last legislative session, which was we moved backwards. We did. We moved backwards.
So I'd like to actually figure out how we could be helpful, because as I think about all the folks who go to Salem to lobby, there are a lot of organized groups that will have a lobby day, even in a short session. And I think we could actually really create this drumbeat,
Absolutely.
especially around houselessness issues, services for housing and mental health, and drug addiction. There are just way too many groups that will go, and if all of us have the exact same thing on our agenda, it will be really hard for even supermajority democratically controlled legislative bodies to ignore what the people want. So I think we have this opportunity as we build up to February, the first Monday in February, and I let me know how I can help, because I think we must do that. I don't think a city lobby by itself is going to be sufficient to make that happen. I think we have to be standing behind community members who are demanding that action.
I agree with you, Commissioner, 100%. And I think it's important that, while I am under no illusion that we will pass any dramatic legislation in a short session related to these issues, we need to preface the full session with clarity that we have a message, that we have a coalition, and that we're going to be ready and we're going to hold people accountable. I hold myself accountable. Public certainly holds me accountable, but we need partners as well. We'll do what we can do here, and I feel like we're doing the best we can with the resources we've got. We're working hard and we're prioritizing it, but we need to start leveraging the opportunity at the state level as well, and we haven't done nearly as much as we could, and that's not on them, it's on us.
it may have come up earlier, but would you give us a preview of what Senate leadership could look like next year?
That's a good question.
Commissioner, for 2020, it will likely remain the same. So we'll have Senator Courtney continue to be the Senate President, Senator Jenny Burdick continue to be the Majority Leader. We're going to have the same Minority Leader. So on the Senate side, it will look consistent for the short session. Now, looking ahead to the next long session, I think there's a chance things could look very, very different. But there's a lot of speculation that goes into who may step into leadership roles at that point.
Could it be Elizabeth Edwards?
Nope. But thank you for the question.
On that same note, I mean, I think the dynamics in the upcoming election have changed radically when you think about unions being the biggest supporter of Democratic candidates, and now many will not be getting the level of support that they've had in the past. So I do think that the universe is shifting a bit. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I do know that conventional wisdom is not something that we should rely on in this election cycle, because we also have 45 running for re-election.
Yeah, and to that point, the general election in November is a really big ballot. It's a big, big ballot, and there are a lot of different ballot measures that may potentially make it on, and legislators will be keeping that in mind as they look at what legislation they're considering in 2020. Now, as public employees, that is not an area where we spend any of our professional time or energy, right? We have that separation. But it is certainly something that we watch very closely because it impacts the environment in which we're advocating.
So I noticed that they referred a tobacco and e-cigarette tax. What would it get them to? Could we get them to refer an increase in the beer and wine tax and dedicate it to mental health and addiction services? They won't do it by themselves. They won't have the guts to do it, but could we get them to refer it? Because I think the public would support a modest increase or even a rationalization of the beer and wine and spirits tax in order if it was dedicated to mental health and addiction services.
Well, Commissioner, there are three ways that something ends up on the ballot, right? Either the legislature refers it, the public attempts to rescind something that the legislature passed, or there's an initiative petition. I believe it would be, if they're not going to take a vote on it in the legislature to pass it themselves, they're not likely to refer it to voters. Maybe that provides them some cover, but more likely the initiative petition route would be the way to apply pressure, but that's not an area where our office can really play.
It just doesn't seem fair to put the burden on the people in the community to collect all the signatures to do something which is so blooming obvious.
So I want to do a quick time check. We're a little over 15 minutes out. We have a few more items of unfinished business, but we can start to leap forward with your indulgence to what's in the draft agenda. We've already started to touch on a lot of this, but I think that will help make the best use of our time. So I'm going to turn it over to Stacy.
Can we go to slide 22? Thank you, Elizabeth. Stacy Cowan, State Government Relations Manager. I'm going to go ahead and skip forward to slide 22, and I'll walk through. I know we've touched on some of these items. Oh, thank you. Is that a little bit better? I know we've touched on some of these items, but just to help set the landscape, some of the things that we expect to see in the 2020 session include climate action, gun safety, behavioral and mental health, vaccines, childcare, quorum, wildfires, water, oil trains, and public records. Looking ahead on page 23, as Elizabeth mentioned, we began this process back in August. We've spent months now vetting and researching the different issues that were submitted by council offices and bureaus. This draft reflects what we have heard. We're, of course, open to feedback and discussion. A lot of that we've had today, which is incredibly helpful for our work as we work towards finalizing this in December. So you'll see that we have 4 topic areas that we've identified for the draft 2020 legislative agenda, and that includes healthy environment, public safety and accountability, public health and housing, and local decision-making. Under healthy environment, we have reduce emissions and invest in a low-carbon future through enacting climate action legislation. This is, of course, one of the higher-profile items that was left unfinished this last legislative session. This piece is meant to cover not only reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but identifying the important role that the transportation sector plays in that conversation. Leadership has identified climate action as a top priority, and we know conversations are ongoing to determine if there's a path forward this session. The second item in our healthy environment category is to increase equity in clean energy access. And this is by making structural changes to utility rate making it clear in statute that the Public Utility Commission has the authority to offer differential rates for Oregonians based on income. And, oh, yes, please.
Why are we not re-examining the Energy Trust of Oregon? It was put in place, but again, another temporary action that clearly has different benefits for different communities. I don't know what this connecting with the Public Utility Board will do, but I think we need to do an assessment about whether or not the Energy Trust of Oregon actually serves Oregonians. All of us in their region pay into the Energy Trust, but only a few people get the opportunity to get money out of the trust. So again, to me, that's a bigger outcome if we're going after the Energy Trust to ensure that it actually serves all of us equitably, because I'm not sure what the Public Utility Commission, what this particular piece would do.
Sure. I'll just say the specific issue of reevaluating or digging in deeper to the allocation of funds going in and out of the Energy Trust of Oregon is a new issue to us today. So it's not something that we've done a lot of vetting on at this point. This particular item about increasing equity and clean energy access came to us from Verde. We worked closely with Verde last legislative session on a number of items, and so this was in part to support an effort that they had pushed last legislative session. They've separated out, there was a fiscal component to it and a policy component, so they pulled out the fiscal component, pushing forward the policy component. So this is an item of partnership with Verde.
I appreciate that, but I'm actually concerned about the financial component because, again, all of us pay into this fund, and only people with houses who own homes and who have homes that are really nice get access to those funds, because the only way you get the money is if you invest in energy efficient appliances and upgrades, and then you get rebated back over a period of time. When this was first put in place, this was considered a legislative compromise, and it's one of those things that the legislature is known to do, which is to put something in place and never go back and check about whether or not it works, who benefits and who doesn't. And that is a huge, I don't know much about this particular piece, but I can tell you the Energy Trust of Oregon is a huge problem that if we're going to talk about looking at regulatory oversight bodies that have the ability to collect money and spend it any way they want to, that would be one I would put on the list.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We'll go ahead and add that to our list to do some research and looking into. I'm not familiar with the topic, but we'll do the research that's needed and be able to report back.
Sad history.
Thank you. Looking ahead, the last item in this category is to mitigate the risk of fossil fuels by supporting legislation to keep Oregonians safe in the event of an oil train derailment or an earthquake. This is obviously something that we've talked about. This piece will complement the work that we're doing here at the city and at the county to address the risks associated with the critical energy infrastructure. The critical energy infrastructure hub. Thank you.
So this is the bonding program?
What we've done intentionally, Commissioner, is left this language a little bit open to be able to support. It's unclear right now. We haven't got confirmation exactly what the legislature will be doing. We've met with some of our Portland area delegation, sharing with them the work that we're doing, the work that the county is doing, and really offering up some different pieces that we think would complement the work that we're doing. And it's about having that conversation about everyone's role. There's a local role, there's a state role, and there's a federal role, and we need to ensure that we're all doing whatever we can possible. And so this is really just to be broad so that we can support that work that might be done at the state. And so I'm hoping to have some more information soon about what those policy options might be.
So I would be very concerned if the state legislature actually passed some legislation that we weren't intimately involved with, because it's very easy to pass it as a bond and make the bond so tiny that it would do nothing to assist us in the cleanup that we would be responsible for here. I mean, the bond, if there's going to be a bond, it has to be huge, right? So that we're held harmless, because we've seen companies over and over again destroy the environment and then go out of business or change their name and open up somewhere else. So this is one that I would not trust the legislature to develop on their own.
Yeah, and Commissioner, the good news is that really the interest and the development of legislation that's happening right now sprung largely out of the conversation that we had with members of the Portland delegation earlier this year. So that was a really good starting point, inspiration point, bringing people into partnership.
I agree. However, they need 31 in the House and 16 in the Senate, and once they start compromising, sometimes the compromise is worse than having no legislation at all.
Absolutely, understood. The second priority topic area is public safety and accountability. This includes improving officer accountability. You'll, of course, recall that the city introduced a bill that would have made statutory changes to the arbitration process for sworn law enforcement officers. The bill passed unanimously out of the Senate after some work group process and a consensus amendment. Unfortunately, that bill was not able to successfully move out of the House. We are working closely with legislative leadership to reintroduce that bill and find a successful path forward this session. The second
The Speaker is very interested in helping us with that bill, just so you know. I think the mayor and I know I talked to her, and I think she talked to the mayor as well. So I would assume support from the Speaker and figure out how we can help us get it passed.
I appreciate that. Both of those conversations have been incredibly important in making sure that this actually moves forward and doesn't hit those same barriers that we hit last time. So thank you. The second item in this category is about promoting gun safety, particularly in the area of safe storage, which is what we expect to be the conversation this session. There may also be a conversation about regulating firearms at the Port of Portland, so we will engage in that conversation. Unfortunately, last legislative session, most gun legislation was unsuccessful. The third priority category is around public health and housing. We, of course, have touched on this, but just to be clear, this includes a piece around funding community mental health to help stabilize community-based mental health services. Again, this is a short session. This isn't a budget session. We want to support our partners at the county in getting that $9 million reallocated to those services, but of course, continuing to have conversations and to highlight the fact that this is a chronically underfunded budget and just doing what we can in this short session and looking ahead towards the long session for additional funding. The second item in this category is to advance equitable home ownership and opportunity, and this is by continuing to support the work of the Task Force on Racial Disparities in Home Ownership. The city supported the creation of this task force in 2018. The task force has been working diligently creating a list of policy options, and they're doing work right now to determine what might be feasible in the short session and beyond. And so we'll continue to support that work and look forward to continuing to support recommendations that come out of that task force. The last item in this category is a statutory change that will allow the city flexibility to extend eligibility for the HOLTE program, or the Homebuyer Opportunity Limited Tax Exemption Program. The current 2-year construction window can be a barrier for nonprofit developers and put low and moderate income housing units at risk of losing eligibility for this tax benefit. The statutory change would provide more flexibility to extend the construction period eligibility for up to 2 more years if progress is being made on construction. And the last category is local decision-making. This is something that is continually in our agenda. One item in particular that we've called out is an item left undone during the 2019 session, and it has to do with allowing local jurisdictions more flexibility in speed setting for local city roadways. We will be reintroducing legislation giving ODOT the authority to delegate speed setting of city roadways to local governments. This is an important tool in achieving our Vision Zero goals of reducing crashes and saving lives. The second item that we have listed here is a statutory change that would authorize the please.
Comment. My son and I had breakfast on Sunday at the Bipartisan Cafe, and we drove in local streets. We took Stark basically home. And it was posted at some places 25. I think there was one stretch that might have been as low as 20. I felt like a hazard driving the speed limit. I also felt very virtuous because I had so much more control of my car, my environment. I took in more things. It is interesting, though, that unfortunately there are a lot of people that haven't gotten the memo about the life-saving benefits of 25. You actually still get to your destination in pretty good time. I always chuckle at the person that gets so frustrated they go zooming by you to get to the stoplight 2 seconds ahead of you. But this one's really important, giving us. This is sort of in that category of local control at the end, about preemptions, about giving us the right to set safe speeds. It really makes a difference, and I'm glad that we're prioritizing it.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. The second item that I'd like to list here is a statutory change that would authorize the Oregon State Police to run federal background checks for our Revenue Division employees. This is needed to remain in federal compliance and to ensure that we can continue effectively collecting taxes. The last item, as Commissioner Fish mentioned, is about protecting and strengthening the city's authority to address policies at the local level. This is something that we include in every agenda. We like to particularly call out items that we think might be of interest or of topic. TNCs, or transportation network companies, will continue to be a discussion, although we have got assurances from legislative leadership that there will not be legislation moving forward this session. It's a conversation that we'll engage in with the work groups. There may be conversations around autonomous vehicles, and that's something that we'll be watching for, ensuring that we can maintain the ability to continue regulating our local streets. System development charges, and then finally the ability to raise revenue and manage city administration. I think I got through all of my slides just in time. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So that is your draft 2020 state legislative agenda. And we, again, just as a reminder, we'll be back before you on December 12th. The conversation thus far has been fantastic. We have just a couple minutes for additional feedback, and we can circle around with
I have
your
one
offer.
issue,
Yes, sir.
and I don't have a position on this yet, and I want to be crystal clear. But I think it's something that we need to at least evaluate as a potential candidate for inclusion on our agenda, and that has to do with the traffic camera question. And right now, under state law, it requires a trained and certified police officer to be able to review the video of traffic cameras. And that has been an impediment to jurisdictions in this state deploying traffic cameras. And so my question really is, can we do a little research here and find out, is this typical across the country? Is it unique? Are we setting the bar too high? Is it in exactly the right place? I would just like us to do a little bit of research on this and maybe come back to the council with what you find.
Happy to do a review of what's happening in other states. Right now, the way that it works, you have both a mobile van that can only be in one location for 4 hours at a time, and an officer needs to be present in that van. Or if you have what I would call basically a camera on a stick, like for red lights or fixed photo radar, that's the footage where you have an officer that has to review that footage. And you're correct, it needs to be a sworn officer. And so we can do some assessment about what's happening across the country. One of the items that had come up when the at least fixed photo radar legislation was passed was having the ability to confront your accuser in that legal system. So if someone contests the ticket, having a police officer be able to show up and say, no, this is why the ticket was issued at the end of the day. But I think there's a lot more research that can be done here. For example, our parking enforcement folks who are not sworn officers also go to court around parking tickets.
Well, I would like us to basically take a clean slate approach to the question. I really just want to know what do other jurisdictions do? There was a legislative push well before I got here to change state statute so that the city of Portland could deploy more cameras, and that would address some of the issues that we've seen around interactions between automobiles and bicycles and pedestrians and everything else. But now we find that the limiting factor is the number of police officers that are either assigned to the Traffic Enforcement Division or, in my opinion, that has implications for staffing elsewhere around policing. But I just want to know what the lay of the land is. Or is this a typical standard, or is this something unique to the state of Oregon or unique to just a few states? I'd like to know what the options are. And it may lead us nowhere, but I'd at least like to know before we seal the deal on what our legislative agenda is.
No, absolutely. And I know that this is an issue that Commissioner Udaley cares a lot about as the commissioner in charge of transportation.
It does beg the question about whether or not just removing the sworn, because what are those
PS3s, yeah.
PS3s that we have? We have clerks that are non-sworn, that all work for the police bureau. There's no magic to having a police officer be able to match something up if another police employee could do it. So I think that would be an easy fix, but I don't know.
Yeah, I just don't have a sense of it either, but it's worth looking into. Anything else?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Nice work.
Presentation. I appreciate that. Thank you
Yeah.
for your advocacy, both at the state level, and I want to thank our federal team as well. That was a good presentation, and it was right on time, and I'm sure we'll continue this conversation as we get close to the 2020 session.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mayor and Commissioners.
I did have a question.
Sure, you bet.
I'm so sorry. My question is, what happens when we have this community meeting about the legislative agenda? Are there opportunities to add things based on what the community has identified?
Yes, I think you had stepped out. They'll take accurate minutes since there'll be a quorum, and they'll circulate that to the city attorney and the city auditor and the rest of council. And then we do have a public meeting at which we adopt the agenda. So community members come in there, but certainly any requests that we think that anybody's interested in sponsoring can be made at that time.
Excellent.
And Commissioners, we're reconvening in December, correct?
Correct. Right.
So we'll have the opportunity subsequent to some of the public listening forums to come back here and exchange
Wheel and
ideas and
deal.
information. And wheel and deal.
Yeah. Thank
All
you so
right.
much for your leadership and your staff's time, and one more call out to our legislative liaisons. They're truly fantastic. So thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you all. We're adjourned.